The kid behind the counter held the walking stick up to the fluorescent lights like he was checking a fishing rod for cracks, gave it one twist in the middle, and set it back down on the glass. "Yeah, old cane. Wood's nice, I guess. I can do $20. Lester Cobb stood on the other side of the counter. 77 years old, the battered brown leather Bible cover his grandmother had given him tucked under his arm the way he'd carried it to church for 42 years, the dark ebony walking stick lying on the glass between them, and watched a 24-year-old in a Gold Star pawn polo look at the thing his grandmother had called the family soul and see $20 worth of old wood. "That was my grandmother's," Lester said quiet. The kid, Trent, by the crooked name tag, shrugged and rolled the walking stick an inch across the glass with his palm. "Sure, 20. Final." Here's what that kid in the pawn shop didn't know. Here's what nobody in that shop knew. The dark ebony walking stick Lester Cobb had just set down on that counter was worth $214,000. It was an 1839 hand-turned African ebony walking stick made by a free black cabinet maker and barber in Cincinnati named Ezekiel Cobb, Lester's great-great-great-grandfather. The stick's ivory handle, yellowed with age, was carved with a decorative acorn and oak leaf motif, and the handle unscrewed. Inside the hollow shaft beneath the handle, in a space about 4 inches deep in the diameter of a man's thumb, were 23 names carved in tiny, precise, period-correct script into the inner wall of the ivory. 23 names, men, women, 4 children, each with a date beside the name. The dates ran from April 1839 to September 1858. 23 enslaved people whom Ezekiel Cobb had helped across the Ohio River into free territory over a period of 19 years. 23 people who had been born in chains and walked into freedom in the dark of night, guided by a barber with a hollow walking stick and a memory for names he could never write down on paper because paper could be found. So he had carved them inside his own walking stick, where nobody would ever think to look. The National Museum of African American History and Culture at the Smithsonian had been searching for documented Underground Railroad conductor artifacts, objects with verifiable names and dates, for over 30 years. There were 6 such objects in their permanent collection. None of them had names carved inside them. The walking stick on the counter at Gold Star Pawn on Hastings Way in Eau Claire, Wisconsin on that Wednesday morning in September was about to become the 7th and the most significant. This is the story of how Lester Cobb walked into Gold Star Pawn with $1,100 of trouble in his head and walked out with 23 people he'd never known about, finally given their names back after 165 years of silence. Before I tell you what happened when the expert walked through that door, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let me tell you about Lester. Lester James Cobb was born in 1947 in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. His family had come up from Cincinnati to Eau Claire in 1921. His grandfather, Arthur Cobb, a great migration man who had gotten a job at the Uniroyal tire plant and stayed 41 years. Lester's father, James, worked the same plant. Lester's mother, Dorothea, taught 3rd grade at Longfellow Elementary for 33 years. Lester went to Memorial High, graduated in 1965, did 4 years in the Army as a supply clerk at Fort Hood, came home and got hired at the same Uniroyal plant where his grandfather and father had worked. By then, it was National Presto Industries, and stayed 36 years, retiring in 2007. Married Clara Booth in 1971. 2 sons, Arthur, named for Lester's grandfather, now 52 and living in Milwaukee, and James, named for Lester's father, now 49 and living in Minneapolis. Clara had died in 2021 of a pulmonary embolism, sudden in the kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon, gone before the ambulance arrived. The water heater was the problem. The 50-gallon tank in the basement of the small clapboard house on Vine Street had started leaking in July. Lester had put a roasting pan under it and emptied the pan every morning for 2 months. In September, the leak had gotten worse, a thin, steady stream instead of a drip, and the plumber had told him the tank was rusted through at the bottom and could fail completely at any time. A new tank installed would run $1,100. Lester had $912 in his checking account and a Social Security payment of $2,180 due on the 3rd of October. His Presto pension added $1,340. After property taxes, insurance, gas, electric, medications for the type 2 diabetes he'd been managing since 2015, and groceries, he had about $90 of slack in a good month. He did not have $1,100 today. He could have called Arthur in Milwaukee or James in Minneapolis. Arthur was a UPS driver whose wife had been out of work since March with a herniated disc. James was a school administrator going through a divorce, splitting everything, stretched thin. Lester had not asked either of his sons for $1 in 19 years. He was not going to start over a water heater. For 8 mornings, he emptied the roasting pan and watched the rust stains spread on the basement floor. On the 9th morning, Wednesday, he opened the hall closet. The walking stick stood in the back corner of the closet, leaning against the wall behind his winter coats, where it had stood since 1982, when his grandmother Dorothea, Grandmother Dottie, the family had called her, had placed it in his hands on the day of her 90th birthday, and said, "Lester, this is the family soul. Your great-great-great-granddaddy Ezekiel made this with his own hands. It's been in this family since before the Civil War. You keep it. You don't sell it. You don't let anyone take it apart. Someday, you give it to your boy." Lester had been 35 years old. He had nodded. He had not asked Grandmother Dottie what she meant by "don't let anyone take it apart." Ezekiel Cobb had been born free in Philadelphia around 1810, the son of a freedwoman who had herself been born free, 2 generations removed from slavery. He had learned his trade, barbering and cabinetry, from a Quaker woodworker on Walnut Street, and had moved to Cincinnati in 1833 because Cincinnati was a border city, a place where free men could work in the light and do other things in the dark. His barber shop on 6th Street, according to the Cincinnati City Directory of 1840, served both white and black customers. He had married a woman named Patience in 1836. They had 4 children. He had died in 1871. His obituary in the Cincinnati Enquirer was 2 sentences long. Ezekiel Cobb, barber, died Thursday at his home on 6th Street. He was 61 years old. Nothing else. No mention of the walking stick. No mention of the 23 names he had carved inside it. No mention of the 19 years of crossings in the dark. He had assumed she meant the ivory handle, which was attached to the shaft with a visible seam that looked like it could be unscrewed. He had never unscrewed it. He had put the walking stick in the hall closet, and there it had stayed. The stick was about 36 inches long. The shaft was African ebony, dense, near black, hand-turned on a lathe with the precision of a man who knew wood. The handle was aged ivory, yellowed to a deep amber cream, carved with a decorative acorn and oak leaf motif, smooth from 180 years of handling. A brass ferrule at the bottom, tarnished to brown. No inscription visible anywhere on the exterior. Lester stood in the hallway with the stick in his hand and the plumber's estimate folded in his shirt pocket, and he did something he'd sworn he would never do. He drove the Buick to town. The 2005 Buick LaCrosse had 178,000 miles on it and a passenger side mirror held on with electrical tape. Lester drove the 3 miles to Gold Star Pawn on Hastings Way and parked at 9:18 on a cold, gray September morning. He sat in the car with the walking stick across his lap. He put his hand on the ivory handle. He left it there for a full minute. He had made promises in his life. He had kept them. He had promised Clara at Mount Zion Baptist in 1971, and he had kept that promise for 50 years. He had promised Grandmother Dottie in 1982, "You keep it, you don't sell it, you don't let anyone take it apart." And he had kept that promise for 42 years. He was about to break the second one. He took the walking stick in both hands and went inside. The bell over the door jangled. Trent was behind the counter eating a breakfast burrito from the gas station next door, and he looked up after about 9 seconds, chewing. "Help you? I've got a walking stick, family piece, old. Was wondering..." Let's see it. Lester laid the walking stick on the glass carefully. Trent set the burrito down on a paper plate beside his register, wiped his hands on a napkin, and picked the stick up by the middle. He held it up to the fluorescent lights and squinted at the ebony. He ran his thumb along the ivory handle. He flicked the brass ferrule with a fingernail. Yeah, old walking cane. Nice wood, I'll give you that. Ivory handle. Can't sell ivory anymore, technically, so that's actually a negative. $20. The handle's hand-carved. The wood is African ebony. My great-great-great-grandfather made this with his own hands in 1839. Sure, Pops. Trent set the walking stick back on the glass. Then he picked it up again and, before Lester could say anything, gripped the ivory handle in one hand and the shaft in the other, and gave the handle a testing twist, the way you'd check whether a jar lid was stuck. Son, please don't twist the handle. Just checking if it's loose. Trent gave it another small twist. The handle didn't budge. 185 years of oxidation had seized the threads. Nah, it's stuck on there. Probably glued. $20. He set the stick on the glass and pushed it 2 inches toward Lester with the flat of his hand. Lester's right hand had begun to tremble on the counter. He pressed it flat against the cold glass. He thought about Grandmother Dottie's face when she said the family soul. He thought about Clara in the kitchen that Tuesday afternoon. He thought about Ezekiel Cobb, a man Lester had never seen a photograph of, a free black barber in Cincinnati in 1839, making this stick on a lathe in a shop that no longer existed in a city that had paved over whatever was left of that neighborhood 100 years ago. He did not pick up the walking stick. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He stood there with both hands flat on the glass and his mouth closed tight, because the only other thing he could do was cry in front of a 24-year-old. And Lester Cobb had not cried in front of another human being since Clara's funeral in 2021. The bell over the door jangled again. A woman came in, early 60s maybe. Dark brown skin, silver-streaked black hair cropped close to her head in a tight natural, round, gold-rimmed glasses, a warm, broad face with deep laugh lines. She wore a long camel-colored wool coat over a cream turtleneck and dark brown wool trousers, brown leather ankle boots, and a burgundy leather messenger bag across her chest. She carried a small hardcover book in her left hand. Lester could see the spine. The Underground Railroad in Ohio, 1830 to 1865. She walked in, glanced at the counter, and her eyes locked onto the walking stick. She stopped. She set the book down on the glass case beside her without looking at it. "Forgive me," she said. Her voice was low and musical. "Sir, is that an ebony walking stick?" Trent shrugged. "Old guy's selling. $20. The woman did not look at Trent. She looked at Lester. "Sir, my name is Dr. Adeline Broussard. I am the senior curator of slavery and freedom at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the NMAAHC, at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. I am in Eau Claire this week for a community archival workshop at the Chippewa Valley Museum. I walked in here because I always stop at small-town shops when I travel. Would you permit me to examine that walking stick?" Lester found his voice. "You're asking me? It's yours, isn't it?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then yes, sir. I am asking you. And I would ask you most particularly, please, not to let anyone twist that handle any further." Trent made a small face, but he took his hands off the glass and stepped back. Dr. Broussard set her messenger bag on the counter and opened it. She drew out a pair of folded white cotton archival gloves, a 10x jeweler's loop, a small LED mag light, a soft sable brush, a small custom-fitted rubber grip wrench designed for antique threaded joints, and a leather-bound notebook. She pulled the gloves on finger by finger. "May I lift it, sir?" Lester nodded. Dr. Broussard picked the walking stick up with both hands, one under the ferrule, one under the handle, the way a woman picks up a candle that is still burning. She laid it on a long, soft black cloth she spread across the counter. She examined the ebony shaft. She examined the brass ferrule. She brought the loop to her eye and studied the ivory handle, the acorn and oak leaf motif, the grain of the carving, the wear pattern from 180 years of handling. She nodded once. Hand-turned. Period-correct lathe marks. The ivory is genuine. The grain structure is African elephant. The carving is consistent with Cincinnati school decorative work from the 1830s and 1840s. This is beautiful, sir. She paused. She turned the stick in her hands and looked at the seam where the ivory handle met the ebony shaft. She brought the loop down to the joint. She held the flashlight at a grazing angle across the seam. She went very still. Mr. Cobb, Lester Cobb. Mr. Cobb, this handle is threaded. It unscrews. The joint has been sealed by oxidation for a very long time, decades at minimum. May I, with your permission, attempt to open it? Lester's mouth was dry. He heard Grandmother Dottie's voice in his head, "Don't let anyone take it apart." But he also heard the other thing she had said. This is the family soul. And he looked at the woman standing across the counter, a black woman his age with silver in her hair and a Smithsonian badge in her wallet and a book about the Underground Railroad in her hand, and he made a decision. "Yes, ma'am, you can open it." Dr. Broussard fitted the small rubber grip wrench carefully around the ivory handle. She held the ebony shaft steady with her other hand. She applied the gentlest possible pressure. The handle did not move. She applied a quarter turn more. The handle gave a small soft pop of released oxidation, and then it turned freely, silently, on threads that had been cut by hand in 1839 and had not been opened since. She unscrewed the handle slowly. The ivory lifted away from the shaft, trailing a thin wisp of dust. Beneath the handle, the top 4 inches of the ebony shaft had been hollowed out, a cylindrical cavity about the diameter of a man's thumb, smooth-walled, dark. Dr. Broussard shone the LED maglite into the cavity. She brought the loop to her eye. She made a sound, a single soft breath. She set the flashlight down on the counter. She straightened up. She put both her gloved hands flat on the glass. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, there were tears in them. "Mr. Cobb," she said, "there are names carved inside this walking stick." The fluorescent tube over the door flickered. Trent had stopped chewing. "How many?" Lester asked. 23. 23 names, sir, each with a date beside it. The dates begin in April of 1839 and end in September of 1858. Men, women. I can see at least 4 that appear to be children's names. The lettering is tiny, perhaps 2 millimeters tall, carved with a fine awl or a jeweler's burin into the inner wall of the ivory. The script is period correct for the 1840s and 1850s. She looked at him. "Mr. Cobb, was your ancestor Ezekiel Cobb a conductor on the Underground Railroad?" Lester's knees felt strange. He reached for the stool beside the counter and sat down on it. "My grandmother, she called the stick the family soul. She said Ezekiel was a free man, a barber, in Cincinnati. She said he helped people. She never said the words Underground Railroad. She said he helped people cross. I always thought she meant across the bridge, across the river." "She meant across the Ohio River, sir, from Kentucky into Ohio, from slavery into freedom." Nobody in the shop spoke. A car horn sounded once on Hastings Way and stopped. "Mr. Cobb, the NMAAHC has been searching for documented Underground Railroad conductor artifacts, objects that can be attributed to a named conductor with verifiable dates and names of the people they helped, for over 30 years. There are 6 such objects in our permanent collection: a quilt with coded patterns, a lantern, 4 route maps. None of them contain names. Names, Mr. Cobb, the names of the people who were freed. That is the rarest category of evidence in the entire documented history of the Underground Railroad, because conductors could not write names down. Paper could be found. Paper could get people killed." She looked at the hollow walking stick on the counter. "Your ancestor found a way. He carved the names inside his own walking stick, where nobody would ever think to look. Where nobody has looked, sir. for 165 years. This is, in my professional opinion, the most significant Underground Railroad discovery in a generation." She paused. She gathered herself. "At professional appraisal, with documentation from the NMAAHC and the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati and independent ivory dating analysis, this walking stick would be valued for institutional acquisition between $175,000 and $260,000. Conservative estimate, $214,000. Trent said nothing. He had not moved in several minutes. His breakfast burrito sat on the paper plate beside the register, growing cold. Dr. Broussard looked at Lester with an expression he would later describe to his sons as the expression of a woman who has just been handed an answer to a prayer she had been praying for 30 years. "Mr. Cobb, I am not going to ask you to give me this walking stick today. I am going to give you my card. I am going to ask you to take it home, to call your sons, to talk this over with people you trust. But I will tell you, sir, I have been doing this work for 31 years, and I have never in my life held an object in my hands that carried more names or more weight than this one. Please, take it home." Lester took the card. He watched Dr. Broussard rethread the ivory handle back onto the shaft slowly, carefully, until the joint seated with a soft click. She handed the walking stick to Lester with both gloved hands. He took it in both of his own. He stood up from the stool. He nodded once at Dr. Broussard. He turned and walked out past Trent without a word. In the parking lot, sitting in the Buick with the broken passenger side mirror, Lester Cobb held the walking stick across his lap and cried for the first time since Clara's funeral. He called Arthur that night. He called James. The three of them met the following Saturday at the kitchen table on Vine Street with the walking stick lying between them, and Lester told them the whole story. Arthur, who had been named for Lester's grandfather, who had been named for Ezekiel's grandson, cried for 20 minutes. James cried for 10. Lester made coffee and let them cry because he had already done his crying in the Buick. They called Dr. Broussard at 9 the following Monday. The NMAAHC sent a team of 3 conservators and a paper and ivory specialist to Eau Claire in October. The handle was carefully removed in a controlled environment at the Chippewa Valley Museum under archival lighting. The 23 names were photographed, transcribed, and cross-referenced against Ohio and Kentucky census records, church records, and the records of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati. Of the 23 names, 14 were matched to documented individuals who appeared in free census records in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois in the years following the dates carved beside their names. 14 people who had been enslaved in Kentucky, who had crossed the Ohio River in the night, and who had lived the rest of their lives as free men and women and children, documented, named, verified. 9 names remained unmatched, lost to history, as most were, but no longer lost to silence. The walking stick traveled to Washington in November in a climate-controlled courier case, escorted by Dr. Broussard personally. The NMAAHC acquired it for permanent display through a 99-year family loan. The museum paid the Cobb family $206,000. The walking stick went into the Slavery and Freedom Gallery in a custom case with the ivory handle displayed unscrewed and the inner cavity visible under magnification glass. The 23 names enlarged on a digital wall display beside it with whatever biographical information had been recovered, and a placard, African ebony walking stick with hollow ivory handle, 1839. Made and used by Ezekiel Cobb, circa 1810 to 1871, a free black barber and Underground Railroad conductor in Cincinnati, Ohio. The hollow handle contains 23 names of enslaved men, women, and children conducted to freedom by Cobb between 1839 and 1858, carved into the inner wall of the ivory in period-correct hand script. 14 of the 23 individuals have been identified in post-crossing census records, on loan from the family of Lester J. Cobb, Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Arthur and James flew their father to Washington for the dedication in January on the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday weekend. Lester wore the dark suit he'd worn to Clara's funeral. The dedication ceremony was held in the Slavery and Freedom Gallery on the museum's third floor. The director of the NMAAHC spoke. Dr. Broussard spoke. A historian from the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati spoke. Then Lester was asked if he wanted to say anything. He stood at the lectern and looked out at a room of 300 people and said, "My grandmother called this stick the family soul. I didn't know why. I carried it in my closet for 42 years, and I didn't know why. Now I know." There are 23 names inside that ivory. 23 people who walked into the dark and trusted a barber to get them across the river. My great-great-great-grandfather Ezekiel carved their names because he wanted somebody, someday, to know they existed. It took 165 years, but somebody knows now. He sat down. The room stood. He paid for the water heater. He paid the property taxes 3 years forward. He sent Arthur $25,000 and James $25,000 and told both of them to use it for their families and not to argue. He set up a trust for his 4 grandchildren. He made a $15,000 donation to the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati in the name of Ezekiel Cobb. He bought Clara a new headstone with her full name and a line beneath that read, "Wife, Mother, she held us together." The Eau Claire Leader Telegram ran the story on a Sunday. The Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel picked it up. The Washington Post ran it the week of the dedication. NPR's All Things Considered did an 8-minute segment. The Cincinnati Enquirer ran a long feature on Ezekiel Cobb's barbershop on 6th Street. The Smithsonian Magazine put the walking stick on the February cover. Letters came, dozens of them, from across the country, from people who believed they might be descended from one of the 23 names inside the ivory. Dr. Broussard's team at the NMAAHC began a genealogical research project that would eventually, over the next 2 years, connect living descendants to 11 of the 14 identified individuals, 11 families, 11 living lines of people who traced their freedom back to a barber in Cincinnati with a hollow walking stick and the courage to carve their names where nobody would ever think to look. And the next Sunday morning, back home in Eau Claire, Lester sat down at his usual booth at the Nucleus Cafe on Water Street with his 2 oldest friends, Clarence Odom and Eugene Pruitt, the way he had every Sunday for 23 years. Clarence looked at him over the rim of his coffee mug. "Heard you made the paper, Lester." "Heard that." "Underground Railroad, huh?" "Underground Railroad." Eugene shook his head. $20. $20, Lester agreed. The 3 of them laughed. The quiet, chest-deep laugh of old men who have lived long enough to know that the world rarely sees what matters, and that sometimes, if you wait long enough, it finally does. A kid in a pawn shop looked at that walking stick and said $20. He didn't know. They never do. If stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel, because some things have hidden worth.